Hi, everybody. I'm Teresa Reed. I'm a member of the Brews and Views Committee of the League of Women Voters of the Ann Arbor area. This is our first of 3 monthly Brews and Views on the topic of voting systems. We're starting at the top with election security, facts, myths, and fixes. The US election system is the bedrock of our democracy, but disinformation and conspiracy theories have shaken many voters' confidence. Unfounded allegations about the 2020 election include that results were hacked by voting machine manufacturers, that tens of thousands of ballots were misplaced, destroyed, or counted twice, and that thousands of people voted illegally. There is no credible evidence that the 2020 presidential outcome was affected by fraud, but some individuals and media organizations continue to sow doubts. At the same time, US elections do face real security threats, including increasingly aggressive hacking attempts by hostile governments. After years of underinvestment, some states have recently adopted stronger safeguards, but the nation as a whole remains a patchwork of strength and weakness. Without further action by Congress and the states, future elections will be vulnerable to both real attacks and false accusations of fraud. It's essential that voters be accurately informed about election security, both to counter disinformation and to understand what risks do call for urgent action. Our speaker tonight is J. Alex Halderman. Professor Halderman is one of the most sought after election security experts in the world. Dr. Halderman is a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan and director of UM's Center for Computer Security and Society. Professor Halderman's research focuses on computer security and privacy, with an emphasis on problems that broadly affect society and public policy, including software security, network security, data privacy, anonymity, election cybersecurity, censorship resistance, computer forensics, ethics, and cybercrime. He's twice testified before Congress concerning election security and serves as co-chair of Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson's Election Security Advisory Commission. In 2019, he was named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow for his work in strengthening election cybersecurity with evidence-based solutions. Last year, he received the University of Michigan's President's Award for National and State Leadership. Professor Halderman is the creator of Securing Digital Democracy, a massive open online course about the risks and potential of election technology that's attracted over 10,000 participants worldwide, including several of us behind the scenes on this call. Of course, I could go on and on about Professor Halderman's accomplishments, but we'd rather hear him speak. So Professor Halderman, thank you so much for being here.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for having me here tonight. I wish I had a beer, but I'm still only drinking water this evening. So I hope those in the audience are making themselves comfortable, and I'm really looking forward to our Q&A tonight. But I'm going to start by giving a short talk about election security as I see it after the events of this November, which really were, I think, a deep challenge to our democracy as a whole, not only in terms of voter perception, but in terms of what kind of security, what does security in elections really mean, when what's at stake is not just the correctness of the outcome, but whether people believe it. So let me see, here my slides are up. So 2020 was certainly a year of interesting misinformation. I think we were all glued to the news during the lead up to the election, certainly, but also between the election and the inauguration, when our connections to reality were challenged in some new ways by an amazing volume of misinformation about the election. Here are two messages that you probably saw. One from President Trump, where among many other tweets casting doubt on the election results, he claimed specifically or pointed specifically to a theory that Dominion Voting Systems, one of the nation's large makers of computer voting equipment, had deleted millions of Trump votes nationwide. This, excuse me, this theory contrasts with the views of his own administration, where Homeland Security officials in charge of critical infrastructure called 2020 America's most secure election in history. Which of these claims is true? Well, the one on the left, there is zero credible evidence whatsoever. And in fact, it's kind of a preposterous claim that an American company deliberately changed the election in a way that, if discovered, would completely end its business. The claim on the right, though, that this was the most secure election in history also is preposterous in its own way. Although we've been making important strides over the last several years in improving election security, the fact is that elections still rely intensely on computer technology that is not as secure as it needs to be. And so if we want to get elections to be as secure as perhaps they were before the era of computerization, when we only had to worry about low-tech attacks, well, we have a long way to go there too. But I think in the battle for the legitimacy of the election, for people's perceptions, we have well-meaning officials on the right making claims that probably are fine simplifications of the facts. The fact is, we have no evidence whatsoever that the election was attacked in a way that changed any, that had any importance to the result. No credible evidence whatsoever. But that doesn't mean that we can stop in terms of our efforts to secure things. We need to be more vigilant than ever, in fact, in the wake of what we saw in 2020. So what did we see? What were some of the preposterous claims? Well, one that you've probably heard going around is this, the story of hammer and scorecard. According to this conspiracy theory, which has been around for several years, since I think since Obama's first election. According to this theory, in its 2020 incarnation, the Obama administration commandeered a powerful supercomputer known as the Hammer, and used a security exploit known as Scorecard that is capable of hacking into elections and stealing the vote. And this is according to purported CIA contractor Dennis Montgomery. So I say there are several problems with this conspiracy theory. One, the source, Mr. Montgomery, has a long history of very publicly making highly dubious claims. Two, if you just dig into it a little bit, well, wait a minute, it doesn't take a supercomputer to do things like attacking vulnerable devices and servers. Hackers basically need a laptop to do that. That's what we found in past studies of vulnerable election systems. Moreover, such a thing, if it actually happened, you would think there might be some evidence that someone in all this time would have dug up to show that it did. But to date, there is absolutely nothing. And to me, it makes wonderful science fiction. Why they even have the all caps names that are typical of secret programs exposed by Edward Snowden and so forth. But in terms of anything more than science fiction, there's not a single shred of evidence. You also have conspiracy theories like these that Sidney Powell, former prosecutor and attorney, espoused these theories during a press conference with Rudy Giuliani that the president called into in November. And basically, the theory is something about an international communist plot that relates to Venezuela, Cuba, China, Hugo Chavez, George Soros, the Clinton Foundation, and Antifa. But also that Dominion Voting Systems is involved somehow, and that they've been able to set and run an algorithm, quote unquote, that runs on the voting machines and flips votes from President Trump to now President Biden. Well, okay, again, it's not hard to spot a few things that are weird about this theory. Well, one, Chavez died, in 2013? He's been dead in the ground since long before a Biden administration was contemplated. But moreover, when you get into the details of these theories, basically nothing seems to line up. A lot of the purported evidence is things like videos of election night returns that suddenly a number in one state changes in an unexpected way. Well, election night returns are unofficial. They're being corrected all the time as new results are coming in and things are being entered. Sometimes results are taken down because there was initially some data entry or other thing. There's nothing that rises to the level of what a truth-seeking observer would consider strong and credible evidence that there is anything at all that was amiss. But yet you can see just from the nature of these claims how there's maybe a little bit of fact. Well, Dominion Voting Systems really is the maker of a lot of election equipment. Well, there really are some known problems in election systems with security. And that little bit of fact is being woven with these long and outlandish stories about longstanding conspiracy topics in order to send a message that, well, coming from people in a position of authority may be convincing to people, and apparently was enough to sow doubt in the minds of many, many Americans about the integrity and legitimacy of the result. But once again, we're talking about something for which there is zero credible evidence that has been presented, despite lawsuits in jurisdictions across the country. So what do actual people who study election security have to say about all of this? So it's not just me, but there's a community of researchers who work at the intersection of computer security and election systems and have for decades been studying potential vulnerabilities and improvements to the security of voting machines. Well, after these conspiracy theories started to arise in November, I and some of my colleagues drafted a letter that ended up being signed by 59 of the top experts in the field. And we state in that letter that although there is, according to the consensus of the national academies, no realistic mechanism to fully secure vote casting and tabulation computer systems from cyber threats, we say there's also, to our knowledge, been no credible evidence presented that that any sort of attack has been exploited in 2020 to change the outcome of any state. We also note that we, as the experts, even when we have pointed out vulnerabilities, have been careful never to claim that these vulnerabilities have actually been exploited to change the outcome of a specific election. That is a very, very different kind of claim, and in fact, an extraordinary one. because of the difference between the potential for a problem and the claim that a specific problem has actually been used to change an outcome. So anyone asserting that a US election was rigged, in our view, is making an extraordinary claim, and one that must be supported by persuasive and verifiable evidence. And as we say, merely citing the existence of technical flaws does not establish that an attack occurred, much less that one changed an election outcome. So I wish we could make a stronger statement than that. I wish we were living in a country where people who are computer scientists studying election security could get up in front of everyone and say, well, no, these conspiracy theories are wrong because what they're talking about is impossible. They're wrong because, well, just go look over there and you can watch while we get the correct result. Why? Just use your own eyes, use your, let your organization go out and observe. We'll prove it to you that the election was entirely above board. But we're not there. We're at a point where instead what we have to do is poke holes in the conspiracy theories. Now, I think voters deserve more than that. I think they deserve an election system where they don't have to trust the experts, they don't have to trust the election officials. They can verify that things are as they seem. What I'm going to talk about tonight is why we're not quite there and really what the risks are of not having a national election system yet that is based around the idea of creating positive evidence of the result and is instead, well, vulnerable to such conspiracy theories. All right, so what are some of the real threats to elections? Well, going back just a few years, it seems like a long time now, going back to 2016 and the election of President Trump. But you probably remember that during 2016, the US suffered essentially unprecedented attacks against its election technology that were actually things that really happened, that were verified by the intelligence community and by the states. This isn't made up stuff. We were actually targeted, or election technology was actually targeted by the Russian government. And what we know, of course, is they've engaged in part in things like targeted political leaks and social media trolling and message amplification. These things have still been going on even to this day. But they also, in 2016, engaged in a very sophisticated pattern of probing and penetration of election-related computer systems. It took several years of investigation for the IC and for the Congress to really establish the extent of the Russian computer intrusions. But the Senate Intelligence Committee, the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee, eventually concluded that all 50 states had had some of their election-related computer systems probed by Russia, and that in multiple states, the Russians were able to get into those registration systems. Beyond that, at least one maker of election technology, the Intelligence Committees had its systems infiltrated, and from there, the Russians attempted to send phishing emails and so forth in order to infiltrate county and local election offices that were customers of that vendor. In the registration systems that Russia broke into, in at least one case, they had the ability to change or destroy registration data. But they didn't. And we know that they didn't because if they did, that would have caused massive chaos in that jurisdiction on election day when people showed up and didn't have the right registration information on file. But no such chaos apparently happened in these jurisdictions. But it didn't happen because, well, the technology stopped them. It didn't happen for the reason that Vladimir Putin chose not to go any farther with the attack. That's one of the things that really worries me, because I think today, 4 years later, although in response to these attacks, we have taken some positive steps. Many jurisdictions now are much more sophisticated about security than they were 4 years ago. But it worries me because not all jurisdictions are there. And it probably still is the case that the thing most standing between us and an even more sophisticated attack from an attacker like a Russia is their desire and will to do that. So according to the intelligence community, we didn't see a repeat of these kinds of probes and attempted intrusions in 2020. And I think the assessment is not complete or not public about why that might be, but it may well just be that Russia figured that there are other techniques like social media, disinformation were a better risk-reward trade-off, or it might be that they figured they figured that it would be better to reserve whatever capabilities they have for some future election. Now, in 2017, I testified in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee's Russia investigation about about my assessment of the attacks in 2016. I think the bottom line to me then, and it remains one of my biggest concerns now, is like James Comey said in 2016, we know they'll be back. And when they're back, well, we've got to be ready. We're somewhat more ready now, but I'll tell you why I don't think we're as ready as we need to be. A lot of that has to do with the technology that our elections depend on, just for casting votes, counting votes, and then for distributing the results. So I don't know how many people realize what a diversity of voting equipment we have in the US, but across the country today, we really have three main types of voting machines. You have hand-marked optical scan, like most voters in Michigan use. You fill out a piece of paper, either mail it in or directly at the polling place, goes into a computer scanner that reads the vote and makes a digital record. But the physical ballot itself is kept in a ballot box and available for later audits or recounts. The other style is ballot marking devices, which are available in Michigan for voters who need them, say for accessibility purposes. On these machines, a voter fills out a ballot on a touchscreen or with an accessible device. It gets printed out, and then it goes into one of these optical scanners. Finally, we have direct recording electronic voting machines. This is an older style of computer voting machine where the voter makes a record, casts a ballot on a screen. The main or sometimes only record of the vote is one that's stored in a computer database in the voting machine. This is the most dangerous, of course, from an attacker perspective, because if you only have electronic records, then every record of the vote could presumably be changed if the machine is vulnerable. Now, when I started studying election security as part of my research, boy, how long ago now, more than 15 years ago, voting machines were largely black boxes. Researchers had not gotten to take them apart, test their security, figure out what was going on inside. Since that time, we've learned a lot as a research community. There have now been dozens of studies, some commissioned by state governments, some academic, where researchers have gotten US voting machines of different types into the lab and been able to look for security problems. And boy, we found a lot of security problems when we did. So this is part of the index from a study in 2007 that I participated in for the California Secretary of State, where we found dozens and dozens of important vulnerabilities in the election equipment used in California. And it's not just a single system though. So since that time, researchers have gotten to examine optical scan machines, touchscreen machines, BMDs, all kinds of equipment used across the country. And in virtually every case, well, we found vulnerabilities that, at least in principle, could allow an attacker to manipulate the electronic records of votes. Now, that's enough to be concerning for sure, but how realistic would it be to go from attacks that can affect individual voting machines to attacks that can, say, change the outcome of a close contest at the state level or even the national level? Well, there are three main challenges, and for these reasons, attacking large-scale elections is quite a bit harder than it probably seems to people who are hearing these conspiracy theories. The first challenge is that election technology is dispersed, diverse, and decentralized. And what that means is every state runs its own system. In some states like Michigan, individual counties run their own systems. And that, by and large, is a form of protection. Thank goodness there's no one central place nationwide to hack into to change all the votes. Now, the problem with that, though, is that in a close election, an attacker doesn't need to, of course, affect votes everywhere. Attackers can read the same polls we do. They can look for states that are likely to have fairly close results where there are not that many votes that would need to be affected to change them. And then they can do what Russia seems to have done with voter registration systems in 2016 and scan all the vulnerable states, looking for the ones that are most weakly protected, and then strike there. So in that sense, a diversity of every state maintaining its own systems with different policies and rules, well, it keeps attacks from affecting everyone, but it means we have a diversity of strength and weakness. And there are going to be some states that are insufficiently secured. The next challenge is that voting machines aren't connected to the internet. And thank goodness that they're not, or at least most of them aren't. It's actually not quite true. So some jurisdictions in Michigan transmit votes back to their, back for unofficial or election night results by using wireless modems in the polling place or by connecting a machine to a VPN and sending back results over the internet. That's true in a variety of other states too. Those are only unofficial results, but it's still a practice that I think even non-experts can see is probably more risky than it should be. But most voting machines, at least most of the time, are not going to be connected to the internet, and that's very positive. But it doesn't mean that we're completely out of the woods when it comes to worrying about sophisticated attackers. So before elections, your voting machines and precincts have to be programmed with the ballot design, the races and candidates. And that data is prepared on what's called an election management system, a computer hopefully kept offline and physically secured that's operated by the jurisdiction or by an outside contractor. So unfortunately, though, election management systems are not foolproof in their security. And if an attacker was able to compromise, say, a county or a state level election management system, well, then they could use that as a point from which to spread some form of attack to voting machines across a large jurisdiction. So in my research and research of other people who have studied security and voting systems, we found that it would be possible to infect the programming that comes from the election management system, which is usually the description of the ballots and candidates. But it would be possible to manipulate that in such a way that you spread malicious software to voting machines out in the field. How easy would it be to infect an election management system? Well, hopefully pretty hard, because this is one of the different places where we've been focusing a lot of our attention as a country in protecting these sort of nexuses of our election system. But it's something that I don't think would be at all out of range for sophisticated attackers like foreign governments. Now, in Michigan, for instance, about 3/4 of jurisdictions outsource, or did in 2016 outsource their pre-election programming to different vendors that provide other election services to them as well. But these are small companies. They're not sophisticated security providers, and there are limits to how well that they can protect their own systems like other small businesses. Here's the website of one of them. You can see that as of a few years ago, this company had on their website their whole staff directory, including everyone's job title and email address. A perfectly natural thing to do, but also something that should raise some security questions. Because if I were to say the Russian government and I wanted to try to penetrate the systems of this election vendor, their MO is the first thing they're going to do. So they're going to go and research who works there. They're going to say, I see, there's the president, there's his administrative assistant. And then they're going to forge an email that looks like it's coming from the president, urging his admin to open some attachment. When she clicks on it, well, it's not a PowerPoint presentation. It's actually some form of malicious software that then gives them a foothold into their network. That's just how these sophisticated attackers operate. So, all right, unfortunately, although voting machines are not connected to the internet, they still are somewhat centralized behind the scenes in ways that should give us reason for concern. Finally, a third challenge, and this, I think, is the most important challenge to any would-be attacker. And that is that today, more than 85% of votes cast across the country are recorded on a piece of paper. All right, so that's great. And it's a significant increase from 2016 and a major increase from where we were 10 or 15 years ago when paperless electronic voting was the dominant system. Now, paper might seem retrograde, right? But it should be common sense that it's something that can't later be changed in a cyber attack. A permanent, durable record the voter themselves can see and verify is right. Well, paper also is not, it's not retrograde. It's actually a pretty sophisticated defense. In any kind of critical system, if we can have a fail-safe to protect us in the event of a successful attack or a failure, normal practice in engineering is to make sure that physical fail-safe is there. It's like if you fly on a plane, we're going to make we're going to require by law that there's a magnetic compass in the cockpit just in case the computer-based navigation systems fail. In voting, paper is that defense. And of course, there are lots of ways that people have in history tampered with paper ballots. That's an abundantly documented history of, in the United States and other countries. But today, we don't just rely on an old-fashioned paper ballot as the record of your vote. After it's scanned in and counted, we have a computer record of that same ballot. That gives us these parallel redundant records, digital ones that are easy to count, hard to change for an unsophisticated attacker, and physical ones that would be slow and expensive to count by hand, but that are verified by the voter and virtually impossible to change through a cyber attack. If we audit these records to make sure they agree, then we get the benefits of both. And it would take a really extraordinary conspiracy to both hack in and change the digital records and go in and tamper with enough of the pieces of paper to reproduce the same deviation in the results. We don't even have to check all the pieces of paper to establish that connection. We can do what's called a risk limiting audit. This is a form of statistical audit of the correspondence between the ballots and the election results that can be used to verify that the outcome is right, while only going and physically inspecting a small random sample of the original pieces of paper. So there are all sorts of different ways to implement RLAs depending on your local constraints. And Michigan piloted RLAs for the first time in 2020. So this is really a new, sophisticated way of doing basically quality control in elections. But also it's a way making sure that we're getting the full advantage of the security that a paper trail can provide. There's just one problem. So unfortunately, most states don't yet do risk limiting audits. And in the majority of states, they're not going to look, they don't look at enough ballots routinely yet to establish that the paper matches the electronic result. So where does this leave us? Well, this leaves us in a rather tricky position, because although it would be far from easy to change a large-scale election result in the US, it's not something that we can say scientifically is out of reach for sophisticated attackers like Russia and other foreign governments that have in the past posed threats to our election systems. So just to review, a realistic attack would likely start by targeting, using polls to target close elections in swing states, and then scanning those states to find the ones that have things like registration systems or election management systems that are the most exposed. After that, an attacker can try to break in through places like election management systems, and from there, attempt to spread malicious software to voting machines that would change some of the electronic records. In places that don't do a rigorous audit, and that will likely be known in advance, an attack of this kind probably wouldn't leave the kind of evidence that would raise alarms. All right, so that's the scary part, the actual scientifically documented risks. And unfortunately, I mean, I wish I could say that that was entirely conspiracy theory stuff. But the conspiracy theories just take elements that we know are real threats to security and will add the bit of science fiction that is, well, we have some hidden evidence that this is actually true and took place. But that's a subtlety that's lost, unfortunately, on far too many people who are maybe haven't been reading behind the headlines or behind the Trump tweet when trying to understand election security. So let's talk about how we're going to defend things, because we've got to do better than we have. So the consensus view, according to the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, a study just 2 years ago, where they brought together leading scientists and election officials to study these problems, a large part of the consensus view about solutions is that two critical ingredients are to make sure every ballot is on a piece of paper, and that states are routinely doing risk-limiting audits to make sure that the results match the paper. Whoops. Sorry. We've made some progress towards those goals since 2016. And the largest piece of that progress being vastly, vastly greater awareness in the elections field of cybersecurity threats. But we've also seen much better cooperation between the states and the federal government on intelligence and security matters, upgrades to voter registration systems, intrusion detection systems, penetration testing, and other technical features of election systems, and updated polling place equipment in several states, including many that have replaced paperless machines. But challenges remain, and one of those challenges is that although we've gone from about 75%, only 75% of ballots cast on paper 4 years ago to 85% in 2020, there still remain almost 15% of votes across the country that are recorded with no paper record at all, where everything is potentially subject to cyber attack. So we need more work to make sure that every jurisdiction has a redundant and physical record that can't be changed. The second challenge is that even as states have been moving towards more use of paper records, many of the states that have made that transition over the last 4 years have bought voting systems that use ballot marking devices not only for people who need them for accessibility reasons, but instead have all voters vote on one of these touchscreen devices. Now, the problem with that is that we're putting a computer interface between the voter and the paper ballot, between the voter and the record of their vote. And we have to ask whether it would be possible for an attacker to somehow manipulate the piece of paper that comes out in a way that the voter doesn't notice. Last year, my students and I published a study that we conducted actually here in Ann Arbor, where we went to test this theory. We wanted to know if we hacked a ballot marking device so that the ballots that it printed out didn't match the selections the voter made on screen, would voters notice and would they tell a poll worker? We set up a mock polling place over at the district library and brought in some ballot marking devices that we had hacked, and just asked people who visited the library to vote using the previous midterm ballot for Ann Arbor. What we found was pretty surprising, that of voters in our experiment, only about 7% noticed when we changed the ballot. That in a close election might be equivalent to just a small number of reports of any kind of problem per polling place, even if an attack affected enough ballot marking devices to change votes across a wide area. Now, it turns out these problems are much worse when all voters are using ballot marking devices than they are when only a relatively small fraction do for accessibility purposes. It just becomes a much more promising attack to carry out. So this is a place where we may be taking a big step forward, but also an important step back in replacing and upgrading election equipment. Finally, I think the biggest thing that we're lacking is rigorous audits. Now, the positive thing is that states across the country are making some progress. 4 years ago, there was one state that was conducting risk limiting audits routinely. Today, we now have 2 that require them, another 9 that have been piloting them or making them optional, and a variety of other states that do old-fashioned audits that may be of some value but aren't guaranteed. Michigan, I'm proud to say, was one of them this year that conducted a pilot, although the big example that everyone heard of was Georgia, which conducted an audit of the presidential election that, because it was so close, the RLA escalated into a full recount of all votes across the state. But by doing that kind of audit, we gain additional confidence that the result was right. And that kind of confidence is especially necessary now when the very legitimacy of the election is being targeted. So what are the conspiracy theories really, if not a different kind of attack on the election? If a losing candidate can convince supporters that the election was stolen from them, well, this is just as bad for legitimacy as if the outcome was just silently wrong. So even absent an attack, failures can create the appearance of impropriety, they can undermine trust. And for that reason, engineering our systems to generate evidence of correctness is especially important. The ingredients like paper ballots, like risk limiting audits, and observability and transparency of the process are critical components of that. So over the last 4 years, we saw more than $1 billion in new funding for elections and election security go to the states from the Congress. $380 million in 2018, another $425 million in 2019, and then $400 million with COVID-19 response last fiscal year. One limitation, though, to all of this money is that it went out the door as an open invitation to states to use it in ways that were going to help them improve security, and many did. But it didn't come with any new requirements. And so enough states didn't take all of the necessary steps that were left with this patchwork of strength and weakness that you've just seen. One thing that would help a lot would be if Congress were to impose some minimum election security standards that states could meet or exceed. And HR 1, the For the People Act, among many other changes to the law surrounding elections, would address some of these election security concerns by requiring paper ballots, promoting risk limiting audits, and better regulating election security vendors to ensure that they're following best practices. So I think election security is a wonderful thing to study right now, both because we're making progress, we face real challenges, and yet it's a problem that it looks now like we can solve. But it's going to take political will, and it's going to take continued pressure to make sure that Congress, the states and jurisdictions take the necessary steps to improve. So it's essential for voters to be informed both about the risks and about some of the mechanisms that are in place to keep them secure, so that they can understand the difference between unfounded speculation, potential risks, and, God forbid, an actual attack someday. Congress has the opportunity to pass comprehensive election security regulation that would help ensure that best practices and strong defenses are applied nationwide. And I hope that they do, because at the end of the day, the baseless conspiracy theories that we've seen in 2020 were themselves an attack on our elections that almost succeeded. They were only possible, though, because elections really are less secure than they need to be. That's why I say that an evidence-based approach to elections is what's called for. It's something that can both help protect against real attacks and can give elections a foundation with which to defend themselves against false accusations of fraud. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Alex. This is, I'm so glad you ended on that higher note, because I was getting a little distressed about 15 minutes ago. So thank you for bringing us that hope. I have a quick question off the top, and that is, does the For the People Act, which is HR 1 and S1, does that do everything we need it to do to secure the elections?
It doesn't go as far as I would go, but I think it represents a really good start. I think it's probably what we needed 4 years ago, as much as it is what we need today. But in the calculus of Washington compromises, I think the election security provisions are very good.
Okay, great. What can you tell us what they are? Is there? I assume it's mandatory risk limiting audits, mandatory paper trail, right? What would?
Well, so it's not mandatory risk limiting audits, unfortunately, but it would create strong incentives to do audit pilots.
Okay.
Senator Wyden had a bill. Ron Wyden of Oregon had a bill in the last Congress that went quite a bit farther in terms of things that security people are concerned about, and would have required, for instance, testing of ballot marking devices to make sure that voters actually could verify them or did reliably verify them before they were widely fielded, and would have mandated risk limiting audits and so forth.
Okay.
But we can't always get everything we want out of Congress, and it would be wonderful to have even these steps now. And frankly, over the last 4 years, that we were able to have so much money go out to the states without really any new criteria for what security benchmarks would have to be met. I think that was just a really inefficient use of the public's funds.
Oh, great. So the money went out, but without a guidebook.
Yeah, without a guidebook, and so some of I don't think there was I don't think it was useless. I mean, we made a lot of progress on a lot of fronts, but where we need to get is everyone needs to be above a certain threshold,
Right.
or attackers are just going to be able to point to the weakest places and use that as kindling to start the next conspiracy theory.
Yeah. Yeah. And potential attackers, as you had said, just pick out the weak link and go there. So yeah, it makes it very easy for them.
Right. Well, we're going to have another election soon, and
Yeah.
we've got to be ready. We've got to be ready for both of these threats. For both the is Russia going to come in and try to do something, and do they have to do anything at all? Because if people will just start these conspiracy theories on their own without any evidence, and others will believe it, well, that's the least expensive, technically, attack you've ever heard of.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's really scary. Have you been in Congress testifying in favor of HR1 or S1?
I haven't. I haven't myself. I think the focus is really not on the security provisions this year. I think in part because there's not an appetite for amplifying security concerns that everyone who's been paying attention closely already believes. And like in the last Congress, there was bipartisan support for election security legislation from both Republicans and Democrats, especially on the intelligence committees. A number of bills passed the House, but nothing moved in the Senate because Mitch McConnell wouldn't let it come to the floor despite bipartisan support.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a little narrow window to get this work done, I hope.
I hope so.
I hope so too. The political will piece is really important. And maybe at the end, I'll ask you about the most, your opinion. Maybe I'll ask you now, since I already am framing it, the most effective messages to our legislators. I mean, as you know, here in Michigan, our senators are in support of HR1 and S1. But what would you recommend in terms of our advocacy?
So and we all are walking a fine line here, because we'd like to advocate for better security without sending the message that we think the last election result or the one before it was stolen.
Right.
And that's hard. But I think in terms of Michigan, one good message to send is that we'd like every state to enjoy the same election security benefits that the state of Michigan does, including that that all voters have a paper ballot, that we're doing risk limiting audits, or working to do risk limiting audits in high profile races. So I think that and as I say, the importance of making sure that we have that verifiable, observable public evidence that the election result is what it seems to be, so that the next time someone makes an accusation of fraud, whoever loses the next election, we want their supporters to be able to be convinced that it was genuine.
Yeah, for that to work, the supporters would have to accept evidence. so there's that issue, which is a little bit bigger. But I mean, yes,
I agree with that completely. But on both sides, there are spectrums of people, from people who are genuinely looking at the facts and are just getting existing in a world where they're hearing all kinds of things but are curious. And then you have people who have a predetermined outcome in mind, or just don't trust any information sources except for a very few that have a built-in bias.
Yeah. I'd like to pop back real quick to your, I think it was your first slide when you had quoted and I can't remember, all I can remember is Christopher Krebs was the
Chris
person.
Krebs, yeah, the most secure election in US history.
Right. I'm sure I was not the only person in this meeting who'd be shocked when you said not even close.
Not even close.
Not
even close. So
here's
the thing. We are both so much more reliant on computer systems that are so much more complex than they've ever been. Yeah. And our attackers are so much more aggressive than they've ever been. So it's no surprise looking around that we've had the SolarWinds hack just in the last few months against critical government systems. This stuff is not science fiction. These are the real threats we face. Yeah. And although we're certainly better protected than we were in 2016, if you go back to a time before such heavy reliance on computerization, then from a security perspective, we were much better off. There were plenty of other problems back then.
Okay.
Also, you go back in time to elections that were less close. We're living in this era where we keep having presidential elections that hang on a very, very small number of really tight states.
Right.
And that's what makes for the biggest risk. It's going to be, no one's going to believe it if an attack targets an election that is a landslide. The ones where it's close are both inherently more vulnerable and more vulnerable to these attacks on legitimacy through conspiracy theories.
So the statement that this was the most secure election in American history, I think is what it was. That's a paraphrase. That actually, it was probably more secure than 2016 and 2012 and 2008, but it wasn't more secure than before widespread computer use.
Probably not more secure than before widespread computerization. And really, I mean, if you go back to 2008, it was an election that, although we had fewer security mechanisms in place, also our attackers were not nearly as aggressive. Yeah. So, and it wasn't as close an election. So I think Chris Krebs can be forgiven for I think some innocent intentioned exaggeration. But if we're going to actually be making metrics that are meaningful, like most secure in history is nebulous enough that I guess instead of saying not even close, I could say, well, really depends on what you're measuring.
Okay. Well, at least it was more secure than previous computerized elections. So he's trying to counter and respond directly to specific conspiracy claims there. And I think that has been quoted and repeated outside of that context a bit too much. But the honest risk is that if people believe that, well, if we're achieving the most secure elections in history, then why do we need HR 1? Right. Okay. So that can work against what we need. Yeah.
Work against the kind of continued improvement that we need to keep up with and adequately respond to the threats we face.
Yeah. So let me ask you, so of course, legislatures in 43, I think, states are working really hard to improve election security. To your knowledge, do any of the 260 some bills that have been introduced actually address election security?
Oh man, yes and no, right? Okay. So there are provisions in a lot of bills that do address some actual election security concerns, including ones about making sure we're doing more to ensure physical chain of custody of ballots, which is important. Doing some sensible things actually around signature verification. So signature verification is a hot button topic, but the fact is there's not a lot of evidence that it protects against fraud at all. So, or I should say rather, it protects against a particular kind of fraud. It protects against a kind of fraud where someone who has never seen the voter's real signature just fills out a ballot and makes up a signature from whole cloth. And Michigan has traditionally used it in a way that helps protect against that, but it's not really a good way to tell if if someone's spouse has taken their ballot and filled it out for them without asking them, or someone's parent who knows what their signature looks like can make a scrawl that looks similar to it.
Right.
And some states don't even bother to check at all. So as we're expanding vote by mail, which I think it's a wonderful convenience, we do need to bear in mind that continuing to protect the integrity to the same level that we have attempted to protect the integrity of physical polling places is important. And beyond that, I worry in the expansion of vote by mail that we're losing sight of the people who benefit most from the protection of the polling place, who are often the most vulnerable people in society. If you're worried that you're going to lose your job because you voted the wrong way or didn't bring in your ballot to work in order to vote the way the boss wanted you to, or if you're living in an unsafe home situation where someone is going to threaten you if you don't hand over your ballot, right? Those are the people who are most going to suffer.
Yeah, that was a really interesting piece in your course about the privacy trade-off.
Yeah.
Of mail-in ballots. Yeah.
And I think we're still thinking that through. And so even though there are a lot of worrisome provisions in many of the state bills that are being considered now, I do think that we need to, as a society, be thinking through some of the security and policy trade-offs involved in these changes we're making through greater use of vote by mail and other conveniences.
Okay, good. That's great to hear. So we need to do a little bit more. We have to do closer parsing of some of these laws and not just be reactionary to them.
Well, there are plenty of things not to like too. Don't get me wrong, but we shouldn't absolutely reflexively dismiss everything in them.
That's great to know. Okay, so I actually have a question here. I'm looking at some of the questions on my screen. I do have a question. I want to come back to this, and the question is, how confident are you in signature matching on mail-in ballots? And are there other options to verify voters' identity on mail-in ballots?
So I'm not very confident in signature matching, and that's because actual signature comparison is just so hard to get right. And your trade-off is, if you demand a very close match, then people whose signatures have changed a bit, or who, when they filled out the original form with their signature, didn't do it carefully, are going to have their ballots perhaps flagged or rejected. On the other hand, if you're really lax about signature matching, then the instances of real retail fraud will potentially get through. I have to say that there's so few documented cases, and this is a really important point to emphasize. There's so few documented cases of what we call retail level voter fraud, where you have individuals filling out small numbers of fake ballots or voting under false pretenses somehow. It's unlikely to be enough to make a difference in any common way. But it's still an important thing for people's confidence to help them know that precautions are being taken.
Yeah.
So there are alternatives. Some alternatives that certain jurisdictions are considering are things like asking people to provide a photocopy of ID when they send in their ballot. That has the similar problems to providing ID in person, such as that you need a way out for people who don't have ID.
Right.
Another alternative, and something that I think would be positive, would be to have a stronger requirement for people who are having their absentee ballot delivered to other than their home address. Mm-hmm. So if you're voting from home, that's at least already one piece of verification of your identity that is associated with your ballot. But if you've chosen to have the ballot sent to somewhere where you are staying distant from your home, well, maybe we should be applying a little bit more checking.
Yeah, right. It's a complex, so many complex issues. I mean, it's really something. Yeah, the course.
Well, it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off, and we
Yeah.
can't have 100% convenience and 100% security all the time. And where on that line we want to fall is kind of a social choice.
Yeah, right. I want to just call out, as you met before we started, Rena Bash, who is the clerk of Ann Arbor Township, is on the meeting. And Rena, if you want to jump in, please do, because this is super complicated and a lot of people don't, including myself, don't understand a lot.
And really, and I'm sure you would be even better than I would to talk about some of the improvements and protections that have been in place in Michigan, especially.
Yeah, so we would be happy to hear from you. Another question that I have here, how safe are voter registration rolls in Michigan? Could a hacker destroy the database just before an election?
Oh, we're pretty safe in Michigan, including Michigan has just replaced its registration system, and we now have same-day registration. So in the extreme case that you're not on the list, you can go and register on election day. It would still be quite disruptive if a lot of people had to do that because of some problem with the computer system. But we have now a pretty good way of handling that sort of problem.
Yeah.
And the registration system is the most centralized piece of Michigan's election technology. And so the one that has the most eyes on it in terms of people at the state level and people at the federal level who do intelligence for threats.
Yeah. I know Rena has mentioned that it's like 3 layers to get into the registration system in Michigan, and that, there's just no way that they could be done on a massive basis anyway. You want to?
I worry more about county-based systems in parts of the state that in certain parts of the state, because we do have such a variety of levels of sophistication in the precautions that that counties know to take, and in terms of some of the local resources that they have to bring to bear there. But Michigan is a really decentralized state. Some states or more and all their eggs in one basket, and that both creates bigger risk, but also maybe allows for more focus on where those risks would be.
Yeah, and some more more uniformity.
More uniformity.
Right. Was that you, Rena? Okay.
No, I'm sorry. I got a lot of devices going on here.
Hi.
Hi. So, yes, I can concur that there is the kind of the triple factor authentication, if you will, to access the qualified voter file, or QVF, in Michigan. So users have to go through a bunch of training. They have to have a unique login ID. They have to have a password. You have to change that password every 90 days. And we have a new, when I keep saying multi-factor, just like you have with your bank or some other things where they text you a code, we now have actually a physical device. It's either a YubiKey or you use your phone. And so the YubiKey is a little physical, like, plug-in device. And so when you log in with your unique username and your password, it then asks you to plug in the YubiKey and then to touch it. So it would be really hard for, I believe, I'm not a security expert, but it feels like it would be really hard to hack that.
And all of that is where some of those layers are new over the past couple of years. That was one of the recommendations of the Security Advisory Commission, that the state make sure we have that kind of token-based multi-factor authentication in place.
Yeah, the tokens are actually brand new.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that's great to hear that those have. I haven't gotten that update yet from the state that they have that in the field now. That's a good positive step.
Yep.
Now, the state in Michigan, they've been quite active about taking security steps, soliciting expert advice, I was really humbled that they asked me to help investigate the issues in Antrim County surrounding the November election, where there's been an ongoing lawsuit about some election night reporting errors that were later corrected. But I recently authored a very detailed study on that. If you're interested in the extreme nitty gritty about what happened in Antrim County, it's on
Yes.
the Secretary of State's website.
I was hoping, Teresa, can I jump
Yeah,
in?
Please
I
go.
was hoping to ask some questions about Antrim County. Specifically, we
Please.
always try to relate national issues to Michigan issues and then bring them all the way home to our local community, because we are, trying to improve our local community as well. And so could you talk a little bit for people about your observations of, what went wrong with the equipment specifically in Antrim County, because that's getting a lot of
Sure.
attention. But then we use the Hart InterCivic digital scanning tabulators in Washtenaw County. So of course, I want to hear your assessment of whether, could the same thing happen here, or could something similar
Well, that's a
happen here?
great question. So I'm sure I'd be happy to address that. So what happened in Antrim County, for people who maybe don't know all of the background, was on election night, the county posted initial unofficial results that were just badly wrong, that had errors in the range of several thousand votes, including basically reversing which presidential candidate won the county, and similar magnitude of errors in many of the other races. And the next day, they released updated unofficial results that still had some multi-thousand vote errors in certain races. And so they had to update the unofficial results again. Even their certified results had some smaller remaining errors, and so on and so forth. They used the Dominion equipment, so this became a question of, was there something wrong with the voting equipment or some kind of attack on the system, et cetera. The state and the county claimed right away that it was human error, and I investigated to test whether that was correct. And indeed, it was human error, but a complicated sequence of human errors. Essentially, what happened was that in Antrim County, before the election, but after ballots had initially been sent out, the ballot designs had been programmed into the voting machines, Antrim County discovered some errors in certain ballot designs, some local races that needed to be revised. So they went back to their vendor and had a new version of what's called the election definition created in the election management system that fixed those problems with the ballots. But they didn't load that new version into all of their voting machines, only into some of the scanners. Now, the way the Dominion system works, when you update the election definition, you're supposed to update it everywhere on all of your machines and on your election management system. And that's in part because the way they code marks on voters' ballots is by assigning every potential place you could make a mark on every different style of ballot a sequential number. But when they went in and corrected one of these races, it added a new choice in one of the contests, and that pushed down by one spot all of the later sequence numbers of the different voting targets, different places you could make a mark. So when cards from the machines that weren't updated, that used those old sequence numbers, were loaded into the central system for reporting, the votes got assigned to the wrong candidates from most of the precincts where things hadn't been updated. So basically, Biden got Trump's votes, Trump got the Libertarian candidates' votes, and so on down the list, and similar patterns in all of the other races. In a way, this is a quirk of the Dominion system. It's maybe an unusual feature of their particular way of encoding races. But I can't say for sure that similar analogous problems can't affect the other vendors. The fact is, I don't believe that there has been the same kind of analysis about problems in the field with the other vendor systems yet. But I really hope there are. And one lesson I take away from the Antrim incident, maybe this is just me, but I think when there are human errors or other problems in elections, we ought to go in and write up what happened, do that kind of postmortem to figure out, well, what happened and why, not to assign blame, but to make sure that we can disseminate the information to other jurisdictions and prevent it from happening again. So to make another aviation analogy, it's like what we do after a plane crashes. You know, you want to go ahead and figure out why so that we can be continuously improving.
How was that? I have a couple other questions, but real quickly, how was that? Who detected that miscount in the first place in Antrim County?
I think the public detected it first, and
really?
one of the other just simple lessons to take away from it was because the results were so obviously wrong. You have to conclude that the staff who posted the results hadn't looked at them carefully before posting them. Maybe you can understand that as this was in the middle of the night after a really, really long election day. But I think just being a little bit more skeptical about whether your computer system is necessarily going to be right, especially in such a high profile as a November general election and a presidential year. Probably a good idea to just give the results one thorough looking over before you make them public. It's just a minor last minute quality control.
It's a long day for election workers.
I know.
Really rough, yeah. So,
but boy, the next day must have been even longer for the poor people in Antrim County.
Oh gosh, yes. Okay, so I have two quick questions, and then we're going to have to let you go. So, a question: does HR 1? I'm reading this from chat. It says, yeah. So does HR 1 protect the registration databases? And if not, does anything coming down the pipe do that?
Oh boy, so I'm trying to remember. I don't know off the top of my head whether and what is. Yes, actually, in part, there are provisions that will be protective of registration databases. So it would be positive in that respect too.
Good.
But registration databases are relatively easier to protect in that protecting a database is a normal computer security problem, right? This is what we do with all kinds of critical government systems. We just have to basically apply security best practices. But HR 1, in terms of some of the requirements it puts on vendors of election systems, would help make sure that that gets done. Protecting voting machines, which are sort of special purpose embedded systems, has its own share of complexity that goes beyond what we often see in other kinds of government IT.
Yeah, but HR 1 will address.
Would absolutely help.
Great. Last question. So who is or should be responsible for making sure software/hardware for national elections has the integrity needed to prevent bad actors from hacking systems? Is this a national security issue?
Well, yes, I do think it's a national security issue, both because of external threats, but also just because the security of our nation relies on us having a government that the people believe is legitimate. But who is responsible? I think the government could be doing much more. It's a basic function of government to conduct elections.
The federal government?
Well, the federal government, in my mind, has a role to play, not to take over election administration, but at least to set some minimum standards like we do for almost any area of society and commerce in the modern day. Yeah. However, at the end of the day, all we're going to be able to realistically do is raise the bar for attacks against the technology. That's why having the physical fail-safes in place and doing public and observable audits is as or more important than just making sure that security flaws in individual pieces of equipment are quickly fixed.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Professor Halderman. You have made us all so much smarter tonight.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, and especially a huge thanks to our election officials, especially in Michigan, and thank you for coming from Ann Arbor, because we know how hard you have been working to keep all of us voting, keep all of us secure in the midst of this this really challenging year in pandemic. So big thanks, and thank you to the League of Women Voters and to the audience for those excellent questions.
Thank you, Professor Halderman. It's great to meet you, and we'll see you around on television in all likelihood.
I hope not. That probably means something has gone wrong.
Oh gosh. Okay, I hope not too.
Take care.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Here, thank you. To the audience, thank you for joining us for Brews and Views. Thanks again to our intrepid tech hosts, Nancy Brucken, Chris Buffington, and Susan Woolley. This was the first program in our series of 3 devoted to America's all-important voting systems. Our next guest will be Jonathan Brader, Michigan's Director of Elections, appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Mr. Brader will be talking with us about the constitutional changes that Michigan voters made to election law in 2018. The 2020 election was the first election reflecting those changes, and we'll hear from Mr. Brader about how well the will of the voters was implemented and what we can look forward to, or fear, hopefully not, in 2022. Look for details via email on our website at lwvannarbor.org or on our Facebook page, facebook.com LWVAAA. We look forward to seeing you on May 12th. Thanks again for being here tonight. Take good care, and thank you again, Professor.